The world we live in today is obsessed with keeping alive. We're terrified of death. If you're a billionaire in the tech world, you put all your money into cryogenically freezing your fingernails so you don't age.
I've certainly met other people for whom some kind of coming close has been the thing that's woken them up to, well, what do I want to do?
We're entering the age of the algorithm. What is the human being for?
We're going through a huge technological revolution.
The biggest threat that AI has to the human race is creativity. All the great ideas come when people are bored.
There are certain ingredients needed to live a creative, imaginative life. Some of those ingredients we've totally done away with.
If we do that, we neglect our souls.
The problem with AI is the equivalent of going to a gym and paying someone else £5 to do the weightlifting for you. You do not build the muscle.
Stephen Hawking describes AI as the most important thing to have ever happened to the human race.
How is creativity a spiritual reality? Hello and welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting, the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen. I am Belle Tyndall-Riley.
And I'm Justin Briley.
And we are discussing, as ever, this topic of re-enchantment. Are we in an age of disenchantment? And if so, where are we seeking re-enchantment? Is the Christian story one place where we are going to find it?
And Belle, I've just realised our names now kind of rhyme since you got married. Belle Tyndall-Riley, Justin Briley. It's only just struck me. And I'm like...
You're right. In fact, Briley sounds like an amalgamation of Belle Riley.
But what we should be focusing on is our fantastic guest for today's episode. Al Gordon joins us. Al, welcome along to the show.
Thank you. It's such a joy. I don't know if my name rhymes as well, but I feel left out.
I'm afraid, sorry, you're going to have to double barrel it.
Riley is definitely a good... I was like, that works. That works.
Anyway, Al, love to have you with us. Let me give you a brief introduction to you. You lead Saint. It's a thriving church in East London. It's been seeing a remarkable upturn, actually, of young people gathering for all-night prayer and worship in recent years. But Al's also the founder of Renaissance. That's a movement to equip creatives and empower churches to be cathedrals of creativity. We'll be asking Al about that. And his new book, Spark, is aimed at igniting our God-given creativity. Today, we're going to be asking, how do we re-enchant creativity and imagination?
Oh, it's like all my favourite words put into one sort of description of an episode. But, Al Gordon, we always start in the same place. You strike me as a big reader, actually. So I'm excited to ask what you are reading at the moment.
I'm really glad you strike you as a big reader. I'm really dyslexic and I love books. I buy books. They sit there and I get intimidated by them. So I panic realised this morning when I was reading through the notes for this interview. I was like, oh, I have to have a book. So I'm sure all your interviewees do this. I have actually got a book that is on my bedside table, so I don't feel like I'm being entirely fraudulent or pretentious. But a beautiful book called The Place of Tides by James Rebanks, which is a book about, it's one of those books where I'll explain it and you'll be like, that sounds really niche, and it is quite niche, but it's a beautiful story of a guy who goes to an island in the Norwegian fjords near the Arctic Circle and spends a summer with a lady who keeps ducks, and it's just beautiful. It's beautifully written. So that's keeping me. The problem is I fall asleep really quickly, so I quite often wake up sort of with a book kind of on my face.
Al, I'm very dyslexic as well, and I think that us both being dyslexic writers, why have we done this to us? Are we just gluttons for punishment? Do you think?
Do you find, though, because a lot of people, they've maybe got a stack of non-fiction, books, there's maybe something to do with what they're researching or something. Do you need, though, that kind of fictional, beautiful stuff to kind of keep your soul sort of fed along the way, Al?
Yeah, definitely. I think fiction... stories have great power, which is why you guys are doing what you do. They have this power to enchant and take us to a world where we're outside. It's like C.S. Lewis talks about the baptism of the imagination. And I think there's a really powerful thing that the role telling stories and the role fiction has in our psyche, our psychology, to stretch us beyond the bounds of fact into something magical is really human and really important. So I try and read a little bit of nonfiction. I also try and read. I wasn't going to tell you the other two books I'm about to tell. One is a book about the Celts, which is really interesting. There's a kind of historical thing. Simon Jenkins, brilliant historical writer, and the other one's a book about barbecues because I'm a middle-aged man and we're coming into summer. And I'm now regretting sharing that, but like,
No, I like that.
How do you cook meat? But you know what's fascinating? Even in the book on barbecues I'm reading, I've started to uncover how they make charcoal, which is a fascinating tradition. Do you know how they make charcoal?
No.
Tell us.
Oh my gosh, guys. So they bury a load of wood underground. This is the traditional British way. So you go to wood, a kind of forester would come and coppice a lot of wood, bury it underground. This is going back hundreds of years. And they would they'd put a flame in the bottom of that pit and they'd seal the pit with earth. And it becomes a charcoal pit, and they leave it for 2 weeks to burn with no oxygen, which is why when you get charcoal, it's sort of burnt, but it still has fuel. Sure. And there'd be a man who'd stand day and night for 2 weeks over the charcoal pit to make sure that it wasn't disturbed, because as soon as air got in there, the thing would explode because it was like a bomb.
Oh, wow.
So that tradition is like a real thing. Now it's done with machines, slightly less glamorously, but in the old days, you'd find in woods in the back of, in mystical enchanted places, men standing in the middle of the night over a glowing mound of earth, keeping it safe. So charcoal, full of wonder, full of embers.
There you go. Who knew that a simple block of charcoal had so much interesting lore behind
sometimes
it?
You find more wonder in the everyday manuals than you do sometimes in the greatest works of fiction, for me.
That's fantastic.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Absolutely.
What a place to start.
Yes. Who knew we would begin with charcoal to ignite, if you'll forgive the pun, our creativity today? That's what we're talking about, Al. If you'll forgive the terrible segue. Yeah. Before we get into the book, though, which I've really enjoyed reading, and I hold up for the camera. You can't miss it. Brilliant, sort of black on yellow. You know your colour schemes, Al, for grabbing attention. Anyway. You tell us a bit about yourself, because one of the things that I was most surprised to read was when I got to the end of the book and the epilogue, and you tell this extraordinary story about the fact that you and your wife were actually on the shore of the Indian Ocean when that tragic tsunami struck, but you had a kind of very fortunate escape from that. But I can guess being there at that kind of extraordinary moment in time would have impacted the way you kind of saw the rest of your life living out. Do you want to just kind of start there and tell us sort of what's led you in a sense up to today and to now? Yeah,
so many of us have moments when we go through near-death experiences. You know, we step out in front of a bus and we kind of misses us by an inch and we think, gosh. And of course, the world we live in today is obsessed with keeping alive and not dying. We're terrified of death. It's the last great, we're doing everything we can. If you're a billionaire in the tech world, you put all your money into kind of cryogenically freezing your fingernails so you don't age. Now, of course, the ancients would have had skulls on their desks, not because they were macabre, but because they wanted to remind themselves that they are just dust. They're gonna die quite soon, and it could come at any time. And if you one of the most beautiful films I've seen this year is Hamnet. If you've seen Hamnet, it's an amazing study of the power of love and death. Really, we don't talk about death in our culture much. So death is really important to remember while you're alive. And near-death experiences definitely are a gift if you survive them, as long as you survive them, and as long as you're okay. While they are traumatic often, I've had a few in my life where it's been health scares or moments where I've gone, goodness me, you know, like the tsunami, we walked away from that going, at the time you don't necessarily realize what you've gone through, but then you come away from them and you go, well, how am I going to live now? Because time is a gift, life is a gift. And we all have choices to make about whether we will choose to look at the stars or the gutter, right? And what we're aiming for in life. So for me, that particular chapter in my life, and there've been a few of them for another book, for another day, I think I felt like they've become sort of, sort of stones on the journey that have helped me think, well, I'm going to choose to live. And I think for me, practically, it's all the cliches, like I don't want to live fearful. I mean, as British people, we're so afraid of appearing X, Y, Z, or we let our insecurity masquerade as humility so often that we think, oh, I'm never going to go for that. I'm never going to try and achieve that thing, or, right or help or encourage. And so we hide ourselves away. And sometimes you have to make a choice to live your life. And that sounds so cliched, but I think life is short. And those reminders are like, hey, why don't we try and make a difference with the days we have and love people well, love your family well, love your friends, help people. And that's why that piece is in the book. Because I was like, guys, all your lives are really short. We don't know. You could be sitting on the beach one day and you could be gone the next.
Gosh. Yeah, it just struck me as such a remarkable thing. There's something I didn't know about you, Al. But yeah, I've certainly met other people for whom some kind of coming close, if you like, has been the thing that's woken them up to, well, what do I want to do with my life? I remember, I think Martin Smith, formerly of Delirious and so on, when he was sort of at the point of making that decision, I think was involved in a road accident, pretty serious one. He says that was the thing that kind of made him think, okay, woke him up. What do I need to do? What am I going to do with the rest of my life, sort of thing. But
that's right.
Yeah, thank you so much. You now are the rector of St John in Hackney in East London. Just give us a little flavour of you've been seeing happen there in the last few years, because I know that there's been some pretty interesting kind of upturn, let's say, of young people especially taking an interest in faith, and particularly sort of you've been seeing some remarkable sort of all-night prayer and worship gatherings. So tell us a little bit where that's all come from, Al.
Oh, I mean, thank you for asking. So yeah, I'm a vicar of a parish in an urban context. We started, I moved there nearly 10 years ago as a sort of church partnership with an existing parish in a very different tradition. And it's been, it's been really joyful. It's been hard work. It's pretty unglamorous most of the time. It's slow, steady, faithful growth, good people. And we've seen God do remarkable things, people coming to faith. Alpha's been a key part of that, just, building church services, all the hard work of stuff. I think about 3 years ago, I was at a point post-pandemic where, like many of us, just quite tired and quite sort of, not on the point of crisis, but just like, Lord, we need you to come because we can't do this in our own strength. We can't, we live in an area where less than 1% attend an Anglican church. How do we serve the community we're in? It's very poor. It's very creative. It's all the things. And I remember saying a conversation about 3.5 years ago to one of our young leaders who's a training for curacy with me. I was like, I really long for you guys to see an actual move of God in the UK. Now, I want to use that language really carefully because the history of the church, of course, is the history of revival. And we have a very secular Western, lens on that, of course, as you will both know from the subject of many of your great works and books and conferences, it is shifting and crumbling pretty quickly. The secular lie has not satisfied the soul of a generation. So there's a rising sense of hunger and thirst, and at the same time, this desire of actually only God can do this. We need a sovereign move of God. For the word of God to be preached and people to come to know him, we need him to move by his power and his spirit. Asbury was a key part for our journey. I was privileged to be there. And honestly, for another podcast, another day, message me on Instagram if you want to find out more. But I was deeply impacted by just the love of God and the sense of the holiness of God. And it kind of ruined me a little bit. We talk about near-death experiences. I think with God, we have near-life experiences. We come close to the life of God. And, we come up the mountains of transfiguration and they do change us. And we shouldn't be afraid of that mystical and that wonder. And I think it plays into the re-enchantment thing of actually, God is a God who loves to draw near, and we need near life experiences with Jesus. And, so for me, it was transformative. And again, I won't bore your listeners with too much detail, but it ruined me. I found myself repenting of all the things of just, it's really easy to lead a church in your own strength and be driven and try and, out of noble ambition, but I think you have to get to a point where you say, actually, I'm writing my resignation letter as a leader and I'm going to let God run the church now. So I came back and did that. I said to the church on a Sunday, having experienced what I saw at Asbury, there's a sense of the love and the power and the holiness and the nearness of God. I said to the church, I'm done. I resign as your vicar. Jesus, I need Jesus to lead the church now. And obviously I didn't legally resign. Someone came to us and said, are you sure you've just, but we began to see God move remarkably. And there are a few things. One is the unity. You've mentioned the joint prayer gatherings, with others, friends like Pete Hughes and Wale, who we run similar churches in similar neighborhoods. And we'd be football clubs that would come together for the national team. But actually there's probably behind closed doors a little bit of, if they're doing the 10 Commandments, we'll do the 11 Commandments series, a little bit of kind of in Christian leadership circles, they often talk about iron sharpens iron. What they really mean is like the knives are out, and unity is not something that comes naturally, if we're really honest. Certainly not in church world, and in any kind of world. You need a supernatural. Jesus' prayer that we might be one is a big deal. So Pete and Wale and I got together. And we just basically had a fess up session, saying, guys, I'm really sorry. I've, compared myself to you. We've and it was incredibly powerful, and it led us to call our churches together. And we literally announced like a kind of, if you have the Bible, if you read like Joel chapter 2, there's a bit in Joel chapter 2 where they talk about a sacred assembly. They gathered the tribes and they consecrated themselves. We sort of did that with our churches. Little did we know, when we have like prayer meetings at churches, what we do, maybe 50, maybe 100 would turn up on a good day, and we put all our prayer meetings together. We're like, we'll put coffee and tea out for 200, maybe 150, maybe 200 is too much. We opened the doors that day and there was hundreds and hundreds of people, young people queuing down the road. And, we've got one coming up in next week, next Friday. And this one, we've already got over 3,000 people booked in to pray into the night. Wow. We're having to lay a second one on because the first one reached capacity. Wow. So there's definitely the theme of this, and I'll come into land with this, I feel like we've been in a season where God has been preparing his church for revival. We're not in revival yet, and we mustn't get complacent and start to say, oh, it's revival. It is not revival. We'll know when we're in revival. We may not know till we get to heaven what God has done. But right now, the church, like Mark chapter 1, we need to humble ourselves and repent and get right and encounter Jesus. That great John the Baptist heralding, forerunning, prepare the way for the Lord. That's the season we're in right now, I think, as a church. Prayer meetings have been fire. We're learning how to pray. And I think, Matthew Henry says this, when God intends great mercy for his people, he sets them praying. So I think the next 20, 30 years of the church in the UK are going to be phenomenally exciting. And we're in the early warm-up stretches of that. This is the moment to learn to consecrate yourself, to pray, to go low, to pursue unity, and to make room. It's a really long answer. I'm really sorry.
No, that was rich. I'm going to be listening back to that answer many times. So good. Thank you, Al.
No.
One of the real marks, I would say, of Saint Church, of your church and your community and what you're building in Hackney is, of course, this idea of creativity. And we are going to break open that term as we go, I'm sure. Because honestly, for any listeners who are like, oh, this episode isn't for me, stick around because Al will not let you disqualify yourself in such a way. Here's where I want to start, though. I actually want to start by reading a few sentences. Is that cool?
No.
Yeah, sorry. I know. But it's because
I'm with my teacher again. What were you thinking? What were you thinking?
Yeah. No, don't worry. I'm dyslexic. I can't pick you up on your grammar or your spelling. But it's because there's a question in that flows out of it. So you say, this is near the beginning, actually. It's in the prologue. And you say, your creativity is spiritual. It flows from your soul. And because everyone, not just a select few, has a soul, this creativity is indivisible and indispensable part of who you are, whether you think you're creative or not. And so that's where I want to kick off with that question. How is creativity a spiritual reality?
Well, there is a big lie that we tell ourselves that we're not creative. And that has to stop, particularly in this generation where we're entering the age of the algorithm. What is the human being for? Well, if we trace it right back to our origin story as humans, then pretty much any way you look at it, unless you stick by the cold logic of the secular myth, we are created. We are an expression of love, and a creation needs a creator. The modern notion of the creative, capital C, is a modern notion. It doesn't exist pre-war. Tolkien would describe himself as a sub-creator. There was the creator, capital C, and we were sub-creators, rearranging the atoms that flowed from God's imagination. So if we start off with the first order logic problem of, are we created? If we are created, then we are. And you can define that, and your listeners will be able to fill in the gaps there. But we're not accidents. We are expressions of a creator and a creation. We are part of something created. There's two words in Genesis that, if you want to do a kind of a sort of Hebrew study, and I'm no Hebrew scholar, but there's a word that describes sort of ex nihilo creation. In other words, something being made from nothing. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bang, it's like bara is the word. It's like something creates out of nothing. That's amazing. And then there's a word, Asa, which is basically rearranging the forming of the planets, the shaping of creation. In fact, the animals are shaped from the dust. When it comes to mankind, humankind, men and women, made in the image of a creator, that word, it goes back to the word bara. We're created ex nihilo. In other words, we're brand new. It's like a spark, like new thing. That tells us something about what it is to be human. We are literally made in the image of a creator. Therefore, the big lie is this. We think of creative people as some kind of super elite, a sort of subdivision of the human race, when actually everything we do as human beings involves creativity. Now, in the age of the algorithm, unpacking and igniting that creativity is going to be absolutely essential. We can come on to AI, I think, later. But your creativity is indivisible with your soul. It flows from who you are as a spiritual being. And in fact, wonder and beauty and imagination only start to really make sense if you understand the creative act as a spiritual act, not just as a logical or a sort of necessity for evolution. That doesn't give account for beauty at all. And that's why the secular myth is totally bankrupt, because we are made to create beauty. You know, like Plato says, you could create in the medium of the beautiful. You know, that there is something about what it is to be human that is deep in our souls, that is, we are made to be creative beings, made in the image of a creator, and learning to unlock and connect and express that creativity. Now, by the way, I don't mean learning to suddenly write or paint with watercolors. You can be a teacher, a scientist, a parent. You can never do anything, but your imagination is a wonderland in which God wants to roam like the Garden of Eden, in the cool of the day. He wants to roam in the cool of your imagination. And recovering that is urgent. I have a quote from Brene Brown, which I can't remember off the top of my head in the book, but she basically says this thing, I'm not creative doesn't work. You know, you've got to stop talking about that. The question is, will you use the creativity that's in you or not? And every one of us is infused with divine creativity. Let's use it. Let's set it on fire.
That's so great. It's it's so great. It's I'm thinking again about the way charcoal is made. You know, like one of the most creative things. It strikes me, and it strikes me that there are certain ingredients needed to live a creative, imaginative life, and to use this creativity which is within us. And the unfortunate thing about where we're at is some of those ingredients we've totally done away with. So like the ingredient of being bored, right? The ingredient of like a friction. So this idea that now we get machines to make our charcoal, now that idea of like everything is for ease and speed and comfort.
Yeah.
And so it's like some of those key ingredients, do you find this, are taken out, and therefore we can kid ourselves into thinking we're not creative and we don't need to be.
100%. And it's particularly relevant in the age of machine learning, super intelligence. I was sitting with a guy who is a big investor in robots, not Elon Musk, I should add, because someone said, well, you're hanging out with Elon. I'm not hanging out with Elon. But I'm sitting with a guy who's one of the biggest investors in robots. And he said there's two things you need to understand. I said, as a vicar, tell me about this. Yeah. He said, number one, there'll be more humanoids than there will be humans by the time you get to the end of your life walking around the planet. So like, how do we deal with that? And they'll think they're kind of, that there'll be a degree of consciousness. So like pastors are going to think like, do you do like a baptism service for a robot that wants to, how do you do that thing? Right. Okay. So first that's a problem for you, Justin, to take away and think about.
Okay.
The second thing he said was really fascinating. He said, the thing everyone's missing right now about the age of the algorithm is that we think military technology, yes, going to be a massive impact in employment, yes, the workforce and the shape of culture, yes. The thing that no one has quite figured out yet is the biggest threat that AI has to the human race is creativity, because creativity is a muscle. You think of culture, you think of learning to paint or learning to dream or learning to imagine. Like you say, boredom we talk a lot about this in Spark. Boredom is the birthplace of brilliance. All the great ideas come when people are bored. I list through Agatha Christie, J.K. Rowling, Paul McCartney, Einstein. Famously, fear of relativity comes up when he's bored on a tram looking out the window and starts dreaming of riding on a beam of light. It's in the gaps that Mozart wrote the symphonies, in the carriages between Prague and Vienna. So allowing yourself to be bored in this age is the birthplace of your brilliance. However, we have multi-trillion pound industries who are fixated on stopping us being bored, and they want to make sure that we've got alerts and pings, and even then, when you think, well, I'm going to write a talk, well, here's my ideas, I'll give it to Claude, who's I think really helpful, and just let Claude do the hard, heavy lifting. Now, none of those things are bad. We just mustn't neglect the spiritual calling on the human imagination. If we do that, we neglect our souls.
I've noticed that myself with the boredom thing is it's often, when I'm driving the car or something, often tempted to just whack on a podcast, put the radio on or something, fill the gap, as it were. But I've discovered it's often when I don't do that and I'm just sort of letting my thoughts wander, as I'm driving along, that's kind of new ideas come to me and things. It is actually, and obviously there's also this fact that, with young children increasingly now, because they've got so many options, they've got screens, they've got everything, they're maybe not kind of accessing their imagination in the way that they used to when you just had to find their own fun in the garden or playing out or whatever. And there's something about, isn't there? Like we're actually quite innately imaginative, and you make that point in the book, from childhood, but we often kind of somehow lose that imagination. I guess the worry is that in an age of digital distraction and even more AI, we might lose it altogether. Is that a concern?
It's a massive concern. And this is why I feel really passionate about what the work we're doing with Spark and trying to encourage the church in the season to ignite creativity. And it's not just like you say for the creatives. This is a battle for the imagination of our generation. And I think, without nurturing that imagination, the future of the human race is really, really dark. The fact is, imagination is the superpower that the human race has. Everything we've ever done that's of value and of creativity and breakthrough and vaccines through to symphonies flow from someone's imagination. And the imagination is like a muscle. This is a thing we don't realize about the imagination. Literally, if you look at it neurologically, 98% NASA found of children qualify in this study, NASA, the space agency, did a study into childhood creativity and adult creativity. And they found that they did rankings. If you look at adults, about 2% of adults would qualify under a study as a creative genius. Both of you probably included. Definitely not me. They're like people who are they're unbelievably creative. They're brilliant. They're creative geniuses. They did that same set of data points on children. And the data is extraordinary. Whereas only 2% of the adult population would qualify as creative geniuses, 98%, the diametric opposite of children, qualify statistically as creative geniuses. Now, what happens? It's not that we stop being creative, it's that we unlearn creativity. Our brains revert into a kind of functional fixedness, literally our synapses, and you can now measure this using MRIs and CT scans, our kind of brain mapping. We get used to solving problems like times tables. Like 2 + 2, 2 times 2 is 4. You get used to these pathways neurologically that literally become the functionally fixed. Now, the good thing about the brain, and we learn this from stroke victims, for example, is that the brain is incredibly neuroplastic. You can rewire your brains. Therapy does this to people. Addiction recovery is based around a lot of this. We're going to learn how to redo this in a different way. And you can unlock the power of your imagination. And this is not hippie stuff. This is science. You can learn to say, actually, I'm going to make space in my day. And one of the things I go through Spark is here are things that we learn that you can actually do to help ignite your imagination. And it's not complicated. In fact, they're actually spiritual disciplines, ironically. The things that help ignite your imagination are actually the same things that God often asks us to do spiritually to nurture our souls. Again, to borrow from the neuroscience field, there was a fascinating study recently. Big helmet, map the brain, look at where your brain waves are. And if you set a person a load of tasks, like cooking, a bunch of the bits of the brain fire up. If you talk, when they're asleep, bits of different parts of the brain fire up. If they are overwhelmed with wonder, certain parts of the brain fires up. Now, what neurologists found was really surprising is that there is a part of the brain that fires up specifically when we create, dream, and imagine. Like you can map it in the prefrontal cortex, in a default mode network part of the brain. That part of the brain is reserved for imagining, dreaming, beauty, wonder, or the kind of creative part of life. And it's kind of unique. Apart from one other activity we do, get ready for it, when we pray, that same network fires up. So, neurologically, creativity and prayer are overlapping in the human brain. What does that tell us about prayer? It tells us that prayer leads us into the wonderland of the imagination, beauty, creativity. And also when we create, we're entering a spiritual state in our brain, a flow state in our brains. So that's just a secular neurological, in fact, the guys who did a lot of research on this is a couple of secular atheist authors who wrote a book called How God Changes the Brain. They're like, we're not believers in God, but here's how we notice how God changes the brain. Now, what we learn from that is the imagination we lose into adulthood, but it can be recovered. Now, what if the purpose of the church was to help recover the greatest human trait, which is our ability to create in the image of our creator, remake the world, be involved in the remaking and the reordering of the cosmos as part of our divine calling. So that's really as you can tell, my passion is like...
And it is such a pertinent book because we've already touched on the AI thing, but I've had exactly the same thoughts. And I was listening to a podcast with Alan Noble the other day, brilliant sort of thinker and writer in the Christian space. But he was saying the problem with AI, and he kind of teaches in a university setting, he says, if my students use AI, it's the equivalent of going to a gym and paying someone else £5 to do the weightlifting for you. You do not build the muscle is the problem.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're talking about there, Al. And I think the church has, as much as this is all very concerning, it's also an incredible opportunity for the 100%. Church to be one of these spaces where we kind of remind people what being human is all about, why we do all this in the first place, and kind of creates, in a world that's fast becoming so kind of privatized and individualized, where you can live a life completely independently of anyone else. The church is also one of those places where people get together on a regular basis and find genuine human community. So I'd love you just to explore a bit about how you've seen that played out in Saint as well, because I do think you've had this vision to be a real creative hub, a cathedral of creativity. What kind of things have you tried to spark, and what have been some of the results of that?
Well, it's definitely true that creating together is much more powerful than creating alone. Artists, even painters stuck over a canvas, tend to form into schools and studios, and there is a power in our communal collaboration. That's one of the things that God does. We always talk about Bezalel being the first person anointed by the Holy Spirit to create, and of course it's not just Bezalel, it's a bunch of people. It's sort of as a list. Bezalel comes first, presumably because alphabetically he was a B, although he wasn't, of course, but you know what I mean. Rarely do you create great beauty in a vacuum. You need the eye of the beholder to appreciate, and to that doesn't mean introverts freak out here. The church is meant to be an incubator for beauty, truth, and goodness. And that fundamental, the transcendental, as Aquinas, and as you'll know, the great underpinnings that flow all the way back to the ancient Greeks of truth, beauty, and goodness are best contained in a community of love, where, hey, you're not going to be killed if your work isn't good. You're going to be loved. And that idea that the church should be the incubator of creativity in our culture has been largely lost. And to our great shame, look at the great cathedrals of medieval Europe. Look at the Enlightenment that flowed from the Renaissance, that flowed from the printing press, really. The Reformation led to the Renaissance, that led to the Enlightenment. The church has always had a key role in technology, and I talk about this in the book. There's three things that tend to happen simultaneously. You get technical or kind of technological revolution. Accompanying that, the next step is you get spiritual renewal that flows from that. And accompanying that spiritual renewal that follows always, without, as day follows night, is a cultural renaissance. You see this anywhere in the human story where you have technological revolution. take the 40,000 BC invention of fire, pyrotechnology, back to our charcoal. We domesticate fire. We have campfires. What follows from that at the same time as we start to bury our dead in elaborate ways? Belief in the afterlife. People become aware of eternity. And then follows from that also, you should therefore expect the first cultural renaissance. Sure enough, bang on the same point in history, you get the first figurative sculpture, you get the first cave paintings. So wherever there's revolution, you get renewal, and then you get renaissance that flows from that. Right now, the church is not in the room. The people who are nurturing and, shaping and curating the revolution are in the tech startups in San Francisco. We did a Renaissance event in San Francisco last month. Crazy things are happening right now in the world of machine learning and superintelligence. Creatively, this is a moment for the church to incubate and encourage the imagination of our generation. Now, why should we work, or Y Combinator, who are brilliant organizations, by the way, be the places exclusively where the imagination of the future of the human race is created? The tech startups and pour money into ideas and encouraging that. But what if, here's a big idea, what if every local church in every village was a place of nurturing the creativity of the community? We saw it as a spiritual calling, that we would become a cathedral of creativity in that place, where if you're a startup, where would you go for support and love? And where would you go for mental nurture? And, by the way, this, the suicide rates, trigger warning, among those who create are 3 times out of the general population. Those who create carry a heavy mental toll. So why don't the church turn ourselves inside out and think of our job as helping the re-enchantment of a generation by nurturing the creativity of all believers through every local church becoming a cathedral of creativity? And what I don't mean, to be really clear, is, hey, why don't we make Sundays more creative? Oh, you're a creative. Oh, I've got a need for a creative on my rota. Could you come and click the slides at the back? Or make a flyer for Easter? I don't mean that. Oh, you're a creative. How can I pray for you and champion you so Monday morning you would make a difference in the world?
We've spoken about Renaissance. I had the fun and the joy of being at the London
You
event
did.
last autumn. I did. And did a little talk with Graham Tomlin, who this podcast knows well. And we spoke about Blaise Pascal. And I think it's on the Renaissance podcast, or will be. So you can go and listen to that if you don't know who Blaise Pascal is. But he has this night of fire, is what he calls it, his own words, this night of fire. And as you read it, it seems like it's like this, for want of a better word, but these things are beyond words, so we work with what we've got, this spiritual, ecstatic, like you said about, your time at Asbury, this like night of life, where it felt like he was experiencing something of the glory of God and a real spiritual thing. And then we spoke about the fact that kick-started some of his most creative work. And so I would just love you to talk to that a little bit. This idea that spiritual experience, and we have people who listen to this podcast who are like full in Christians, not at all, somewhere in between. But this idea of like, there's something mystic about the creative process and being creative. And I'd love you to just talk to that a little, if you could.
Yeah, and I talk about Pascal's Night of Fire in the book a lot. And it's a sort of, I find it really encouraging because he's like a mathematician genius, right? It's not like he's just going off and making, hits for the charts. He credits that spark as being the thing that really helped him. And it was so, as you will know, Belle, because you're a Pascal expert, as I've learned. It was so impactful. He wrote a little testimony on a piece of paper, sort of like 10:30 at night, fire, fire, fire. And he would stitch that piece of paper in the lining of his coat. And they only found it after he died. And for decades, he had it carried around close to his heart. So formative was that spiritual experience on his ability to imagine and dream and create. And by the way, mathematics is incredibly creative. You've got to think outside the box. So there is something remarkable about the spiritual and the mystical and the role of beauty and wonder in our creative process, whether you're a person of faith or not. Here's the thing that we often miss. It's sometimes harder to see the spark of creativity and the ideas and imagination and inspiration in the sunlight. If you stand by a bonfire in the sunlight, you can't see the sparks in the sky. It's actually in the dark that you see the embers and you see the sparks. Now, the reason I share that is because many of us who are wanting to create, wanting to sort of build the new will struggle. It's hard, it's unseen, it's obscure. Now, imagination and ideation and kind of inspiration are play better in the dark than they do in the sunlight of success. It's actually sometimes in the dark of it being really hard and it being a challenge that we actually experience the spark of creativity. So Pascal teaches us a really valuable thing, that what happens in private and what's sown to the heart, that place of encounter, that's the spiritual, actually has an incredibly powerful role at igniting creativity. And it often happens in the hard times, in the embers, in the ashes, in the bits which aren't particularly glamorous. And so just as an encouragement, if you are struggling with your mental health, if you're finding it really hard, please don't discount the fact that God is able to meet you in that rich shadow. In fact, the name Bezalel, I reference Bezalel, first person to be, filled with the Holy Spirit in the Bible. But the name Bezalel in the Hebrew means in the shadow. In the shadow. So great creativity often emerges in the shadows, in the dark places, in the hard times, in the secret nights of encounter, in the nights of fire, that no one knew about Pascal's night of fire till he was dead and gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, something that kind of goes alongside in the book, that your own thoughts and experiences around creativity, Al, is the sort of story of Saint itself as a church, and the fact that obviously when you began there, it was a kind of beautiful but partly derelict building at that point, water coming in through the roof. And at some point, I think you got a vision for this becoming a cathedral of creativity, but that meant making the place look and feel and act as a kind of portal for creativity. And so the building itself, although we know church isn't the building, but the building itself has been a kind of significant symbol almost, I think, of that restoration and that kind of bringing back. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the journey of St. John in Hackney itself and what you've seen happen there over the last several years?
Well, we've had the great joy of working. My wife and I work with an amazing team, and sometimes people inside the church, sometimes people outside the church. I remember we quite early on had the great joy of working with an artist called Ez Devlin, who is remarkable. And I reached out to Ez Devlin, having seen a Netflix show she'd done. She's the kind of probably I think the most interesting and large scale visual artist working in the world today in terms of her scale and scope. She does everything from the Olympics to Glyndebourne to Beyonce's live shows, Kanye, everything U2 you've seen, anything sort of public spectacle that's like, wow, that is amazing, and is an incredible artist. And we reached out to her, and fun enough, I'd actually worked with her 20 years ago when I was in film. I started my career in the film industry, and she's a sort of set designer by background. Anyhow, so Ez became a kind of friend and a mentor, and it was her who said to me one day, Liv and I were sitting in the kind of gallery of this church that was pretty run down, that needed serious love, bullet holes over the door, just falling apart. And she said, these churches they should be cathedrals of creativity. They're beautiful places. Basically her charge was like, this needs to be a sort of symbol of life and resurrection and creativity. And I think sometimes as people of faith, we are very dualist. We think of, well, the spiritual good, matter bad. Let's have uncomfortable chairs because chairs are expensive and, they'll burn in the final judgment, so we don't need them. That's nonsense. It's nonsense. Matter matters. As a Christian, the starting point of my story in Jesus is the incarnation, that God becomes flesh and blood, to quote Eugene Peterson, moves into the neighborhood. So matter, dust, is glory in the God story. This stuff is important. So how we live and the spaces we shape and the way we carry matter and space and beauty and life is not like an optional extra. It is part of who we are as people trying to work out God's creativity in our midst. And it's, of course, the great, the Spanish missionaries in Latin America would build these, what they would call slum cathedrals, these incredible cathedrals in the favelas, and people would flock to them because suddenly there was a kind of an embassy of beauty in the midst of real need. And I'm not, they're not uncomplex as empire. There's all sorts of things to work through, those kind of things. But so often we miss that the spiritual is meant to be an embassy for wonder. And yet we reduce it to being a kind of museum for mundanity. And we must stop that and raise our sights and dream a little bit. So yeah, for us, the church has been a story. It's been totally mad. We've had crazy things happen. We've started a brewery, and we've worked with a guy called John Pawson, who's the father of modern minimalism. New Wall Street Journal describes him as that. He's an amazing architect and, again, a great mentor to what we've done here. So we try to bring in people who can help us think outside the box. And, what I've learned is that, I talk a bit about this in Spark, like most of the time we fail to execute ideas because we're afraid to make the ask. Whereas most people, are really willing to help. Particularly if they're really good at what they do, they've usually learned that it's better to give than receive. It's better to give yourself away, and you learn more by being involved in interesting things. So making the ask, being not afraid to do that. So we've had a crazy ride, through a pandemic of restoring a building that you're all welcome. Please come and visit, or you can find me on Instagram and I'll show you the photos. But it's been a crazy story of just working out what beauty looks like, so that we can love people well.
It is beautiful. And, like I said, I was there in the autumn. What's amazing about it, I'd never been to Hackney before, actually, is you can't tell where the church stops. And the lines are so blurred. Do you know what I mean? Between inside and outside the church grounds, you actually can't tell. Have I stepped onto church grounds at this point? Oh, I've been in Saint for the past 2 minutes wandering around. I didn't know. It's that embeddedness in its local community. I've never seen anything quite like it. It felt so
you
right
need to come to Hackney
in that
more.
way. Yeah, I do. That was my main takeaway actually from Renaissance.
Please come back. Please come back. We should do a Renaissance thing this autumn. It'd be so fun. But let's offline that. Your listeners will be checking out at this point.
But it is. Do you find that space, if you like, creating a beautiful space, does end up drawing creatives? I mean, obviously, you've already said Hackney, is a place of contrast. There is great poverty. You had the street that was dubbed Murder Mile, just a short distance from the church, and yet it's kind of bustling with creatives and microbreweries that were popping up and all kinds of things. So I guess the church is kind of creating, I don't know, some kind of a meeting ground for all of those contrasting things.
I think we have a very narrow view sometimes of creativity being a sort of middle class concern of the creative. And again, that's what I really want to go for, is that I remember one of the first encounters I had with a teenager in the church we took it on was a kid who ran in the church wanting sanctuary because he had a gun that he'd been given in a murder, and he was in trouble with the police, and he was basically like, help, what do I do? And we prayed together. He became a Christian that day. I think he managed to avoid he kind of turned his life around. And the last thing I saw him online a few months back. He's become a very, very successful and very well-known, almost household name grime artist. Wow. Now, I say that because we think of creativity sometimes as flowing from a kind of art school, educated, middle class background. Tech, one of the things we really, really believe in here is the creativity of all believers and the 99 who don't come to church. So actually, we've seen some incredible creativity flow from kids on estates who have got no GCSEs. So I think we have to challenge the notion a little bit of the elitism around creativity. And it's really important. I think, if you look at what the human is going to be good for, we need to encourage the arts and creativity. And so much of that is down to entrepreneurs, the permission giving the church can give. So I think for me, the neighborhood we're in, incredibly diverse. I lead a church that is 75% global majority heritage with great joy. And it is a wonder to watch the creativity of the people there. And it's not just expressed through the classic creative fields, but I have a mum in my congregation I'm thinking of who's raising her kids on an estate. She is just like the anointing of heaven is on her creativity. Doesn't look like what the graphic designer next to her looks like, but she is an entrepreneur. She is an evangelist. She is doing incredible things, working with young people. So I think we want to blow the doors off what we define creativity as a little bit. And then I think also poverty, some of the most creative people, like where we are, is incredibly poor. It's some of the poorest neighborhoods in the UK. Centre of, like you mentioned, Murder Mile, that's now no longer called Murder Mile, thank God. But there's still, have a very, very, half the kids where we are still below the poverty line, with the school at the end of the street where is a church school, all the kids are on free school meals. So we're not, this is sort of gentrification is a myth really in neighborhoods like this. But what I've noticed is actually, there is great creativity when there is very little. In fact, talk about this in Spark, constraints make you really interesting. It helps you to think outside the box. You look at the great creative work that's happened in the UK in the last decades, some of the great art forms, drill and grime and street art have come because there's no room for these kind of expressions in classical fields of music and art galleries. And yet, ironically, probably our biggest artist the last 10 years, Stormzy, who's performed at Saint. Stormzy is, having a massive cultural impact that's arisen from, estate culture. Or you look at Banksy or Laquena or some of the artists who are coming through. They are highly capable artists, but they've learnt their craft on the streets. So definitely really exciting neighborhoods to be in.
I think, and I was toying this out actually, toying with this in my head and kind of trying to piece it together actually for Renaissance a while ago. There's something about creativity, a creative act, at its best being a truth-telling act, and whether that's like writing a poem or whether that's parenting or just all of it, like creativity at its best is finding a way to tell the truth, make the truth, live the truth in a world that is full of lies.
Yeah,
that seems to be like what I'm toying with. And then it makes total sense that that's a spiritual act, because I'm the Gospel of John is my professional and personal home. It's where I spent a lot of time, and in that, Jesus calls the Holy Spirit the Spirit of Truth.
Yes.
So it makes so much sense to me that this act of creativity being this kind of truth-telling endeavor is an inherently spiritual act when we call the Holy Spirit the Spirit of Truth.
Yes.
It seems to me. And it seems like that's what you're picking at in some ways, in like picking up Stormzy. Like he just had to tell the truth.
Yeah.
Like wherever he could, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's the fundamentals, the transcendentals. Plato talks about, Augustine picks up on, Aquinas does, that actually triggered the first Renaissance in medieval Europe, was these concepts of truth, beauty, and goodness. And here's the thing that's really, really remarkable. Most creators can't resist being in their creation. Have you noticed this? Like, take film. Alfred Hitchcock appears in 39 of his films. Stan Lee is in every Marvel universe. Martin Scorsese is in the back of the taxi in Taxi Driver. Tarantino disposes of bodies in Pulp Fiction. The list is long. And that's because the director and the imaginer and the creator loves to do a cameo and step into the frame. Now, when Jesus comes to earth, this is a significant thing, because the author of life, the creator of the universe, if you hold that Jesus is who he says he is and rose from the dead, what you've got is the cameo of the creator, describing himself as the truth and stepping into the human space and creating. Now, I often, I hear people, and it drives me mad, I hear people talk about Jesus' ministry as a 3-year period. Right? Jesus, how old was Jesus when he died? We think like 33. So we're like, 30th birthday, he becomes like Jesus. That's when his creative, his like Messiah era was. Okay, like we know that Jesus spends 30 years of his life here on earth in obscurity. But we do know what he's doing at that time, because we're told in the Gospels, that's Joseph's son, the carpenter's son. He would have been in the workshop, and it wasn't just like fine woodworking. It was basically building. It was, it was building. It was manual labor. working with wood. Now, I find it fascinating when we read that little bit in the Old Testament about Bezalel, the anointing of God comes on Bezalel. And one of the specific prescriptions that Bezalel is given by God is, I'm putting my spirit on you. I'm filling you with skill, wisdom, authority, knowledge, all kinds of skills in order to work with wood. What does Jesus do for 30 years? He operating in the Bezalel calling on the human life to create, to shape, to make. So I would argue that Jesus' ministry is predominantly one of creativity, unseen in a workshop working with wood, with 3 years of bonus, raising the dead, healing the sick, saving the world.
I love it.
Are you
I love
calling
it.
that like the icing on top, Al?
It's the cherry on the cake. But the point is this: the truths, the author steps into the cameo, into the frame, and
Yeah.
truth is
Yeah.
a person who say, I'm the way, the truth, the
Yes.
life. So to unlock your creativity, you know, I would go as far as to say, if you don't know Jesus, if you've never prayed a prayer, let me encourage you, purely from a selfish point of view, to ignite your creativity, call on the Creator. His name is Jesus. He's the way, the truth, the life. And having him in your creative process is an unfair advantage, therefore.
Yeah, I love that. You used that phrase a couple of times in the book. It's the unfair advantage. I mean, we're going to have to start to bring this to the land. So many other places that I would have loved to have gone with you on this conversation, Al. But one of the things that, just coming back to something you said earlier, and that I think ties into what we've referenced a few times around the AI revolution and so on, is you said every revolution, technological revolution, has produced an era of renewal, which has led to Renaissance. Now, obviously, we know we're going through a huge technological revolution.
Right.
Maybe we will be outnumbered by robots before the end of the century or whatever. A lot of articles, doing the rounds about all the dangers and concerns, about us offloading our creativity onto AI and everything else. So what do you see happening now? What will, if this is the big revolution we're currently starting to live through, what's the renewal, and what do you anticipate will be the Renaissance?
So Stephen Hawking describes AI as the most important thing to have ever happened to the human race. I would argue that's probably a reductionist view. The incarnation and resurrection is important as well. Thinkers like, Yuval Noah Harari talk about this being the last generation of Homo sapiens because of the impact tech is going to have on what it is to be human. So we're definitely living through the big one. This is the big one. This will dwarf everything else that we've ever experienced as a human race. So revolution, double tick, like no argument around that. Spiritual renewal, question mark. Like, we should expect that alongside the beginnings of revolution, we will see the beginnings of a spiritual hunger as people are turning back. You had this with the Industrial Revolution, the Luddites, and William Morris, who was a Christian, all the way through to, the kind of the Great Awakenings. As society shifts and changes, you had the Renaissance, the Revolution, the printing press, and of course the Reformation that followed. You get shifts that start to uncover the spiritual nakedness that the technology is revealing and shining a light on. Now, I see that extensively right now in the West. Of course, in different parts of the world, you have, see the conversation, why do miracles happen in developing or, the global South more easily? And the answer is, well, there's a different paradigm. But where we are, we've had this saturated paradigm of the secular myth that has meant we've had the reductionist view of both our souls and the creative potential of the universe, I think. So right now, definitely revolution, definitely the signs of spiritual renewal bubbling up. And that's really interesting. I mean, we're seeing that anecdotally in our numbers. We baptized more people at our parish in the last year than we did in the previous 8 years cumulative. So God is doing something new in this moment. We're seeing hundreds of young people come to faith. And this is not hype. This is actually hope. These are people who are experiencing, nothing to do with us or us sort of doing a good job. There is a spiritual hunger. Therefore, we should expect a renaissance to flow from that. The only question, and this is a really, really important question, is will we show up to that renewal? Will we get our hearts ready spiritually, individually? And will we help shape the kind of renaissance? There's no guarantee that renaissance is going to be for good. It could be, a renaissance into a different kind of, as Harari would argue, at the end of the human race, into a kind of cyborg weird utopia, which would be disastrous and dark. So I think we have an opportunity to be involved in creating something good and beautiful and true, and build cathedrals of creativity. Now, how we do that, the essential thing is that we break the heresy that creativity is for the priesthood of the exclusive, either the priesthood of the digital, the AI, that we delegate the function of our souls for beauty and wonder and truth to an algorithm, or that we don't release the creativity of every single human being. And so my passion right now is that, like, we would get people who, in this moment of great revolution, of spiritual hunger and renewal, would actually stop saying, I'm not creative, and start to create, start to pursue beauty, wonder, goodness, truth, start to make the world better. Because the reality is, as David Bentley Hart, the theologian, says, evil is a parasitical wasting disease. Creativity is the opposite of that. Evil has no originality. But if you want to make the world better, you have to create. And so young people listening, people towards the end of their lives, it doesn't matter how old or how young, what your background has been, there is a mandate. Even I go as far as spiritually to say a calling on this generation, whether you know God or not, to reawaken your soul, ignite your God-given creativity, and let the world spark with wonder again, because otherwise the future is not exciting. And with that, the future is full of wonder, and we'll see amazing things happen.
What a place. What a place to land.
Oh.
You can tell you're good at sermon writing, Al. Like, you just know exactly where to land the plane.
I'm so sorry.
What are you apologising for? That's the best
Perfect.
sort of
Perfect.
It makes like what I want is like the credits to roll immediately and Justin and I to not have to dull that.
Justin will now sing the new theme.
Oh, this is
theme, guys.
We do. It's very ethereal.
It's quite.
I won't sing it.
Trap, but I mean more of a Justin led. Could Justin not do a Christmas theme tune?
I could break out my guitar. It has been known to happen.
I think it's
I'm
time.
not sure anyone wants it, but
Right in.
The Renaissance is coming, Justin.
Yeah.
Well, look, hey, Al, thank you so much. Thank you for the book. Spark by Al Gordon, Ignite Your God-Given Creativity. We'll make sure there's a link, of course, from today's show. And as we said from the outset, this isn't just for the artists and musicians. There are so many ways in which Al breaks open creativity across business, education, science. For me, it was a real tonic to my soul as well, Al. So thank you very much for the book. Really, really enjoyed reading it. And thank you for joining us on this week's edition of Re-Enchanting. God bless you.
It has been such a privilege. I have loved chatting. I feel like I've spoken too much. There's always the danger when you go on a podcast and you sort of speak. But I love, well, let's continue the conversation offline. And we'd love to have you guys come to Renaissance again and hang out. And I promise to show you more of the churchyard.
I want to see the bees as well. I want to see the beehives.
Just directly above me is 6 bustling beehives.
Any church that has their own bees I'm in. It's like, say no more. I'm in, I'm there. That invitation, of course, extends to you, listeners. Go to St. Church, go to Hackney. It's a joy, it's a delight. It is a creative cathedral, a cathedral for the creatives. So thank you for joining us for this conversation. seenandunseen.com/give is, of course, where you can go if you want to make more conversations like this happen, but you know that. So what I should really say is, until next time, goodbye.